Today is Tuesday, June 2nd, 2026, and today is National Leave the Office Early Day, which honestly feels less like a holiday and more like a deeply reasonable suggestion. There are very few moments in human history where someone left work early and accidentally caused the collapse of civilization. Probably. And oddly enough, that connects to today's episode better than I expected, because June 2nd kept circling back to systems humans create to keep chaos manageable. Empires trying to maintain order, governments trying to define citizenship, computers trying to predict catastrophe before human beings accidentally destroy themselves. Which sounds dramatic, but also describes a surprising amount of modern history. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your guide through the tiny historical details that somehow make humanity look even stranger. On June 2nd, 455, the Vandals entered and sacked Rome. And even though the phrase, the fall of Rome, tends to blur together in people's minds, this was one of those moments that deeply damaged Rome's psychology, because Rome still carried symbolic weight far beyond its military reality. The empire had already weakened. Political instability was constant. Leadership changed rapidly. Power structures were fractured. But Rome itself still represented permanence. And then the Vandals arrived. Now, interestingly, modern use of the word Vandal makes people imagine meaningless destruction. But historically, the situation was more complicated than that. The Vandals were a Germanic people who already built a kingdom in North Africa. And when they entered Rome, the city wasn't annihilated in one explosive cinematic event. Instead, accounts suggest systematic looting over multiple days. Treasure, religious objects, political symbols, wealth accumulated across centuries, removed piece by piece. And honestly, one thing I kept thinking about while reading this story is how civilizations often decline emotionally before they fully disappear physically. At some point, people stop believing the system is permanent. And once that confidence breaks, everything starts to feel fragile. That psychological shift matters historically, because large systems survive partly through shared belief. The idea that this structure will still exist tomorrow. Rome losing that certainty may have been just as important as losing the material wealth itself. And centuries later, another government would attempt something almost opposite, expanding membership instead of watching a system fracture apart. On June 2nd, 1924, the United States Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. And like many major historical laws, the reality surrounding it was much more complicated than the headline sounds. Because Native Americans had obviously lived on the continent long before the United States existed. Yet legal citizenship status remained inconsistent for decades, depending on treaties, military service, state laws, and federal policies. Some Native Americans had already obtained citizenship individually under certain circumstances. Others had not. The 1924 Act attempted to standardize that legally nationwide. But what fascinates me most about this story is how citizenship itself is basically a human-created system of belonging. A government deciding these people officially count as part of the structure. And historically, humans have argued about that constantly. Who belongs? Who votes? Who receives protection? Who gets excluded? The Indian Citizenship Act also didn't magically solve broader inequalities overnight. Many Native Americans still faced voting restrictions at state level afterward, which is another reoccurring historical pattern. Legal recognition and lived reality don't always arrive simultaneously. And honestly, I think one reason citizenship debates become emotionally powerful is because belonging itself is emotionally powerful. People want acknowledgement, representation, recognition inside the system governing their lives. even when those systems are imperfect. And then by the 1980s, human anxiety about large systems had become technological enough that people started worrying computers might accidentally trigger nuclear war, which is how we arrive at one of the strangest influential movies of the Cold War. On June 2nd, 1983, the film WarGames was released. And honestly, it's difficult to fully explain how psychologically perfect this movie was for the early computer era. Because suddenly people had home computers, but very little understanding of what computers might eventually become capable of. The internet barely resembled modern life yet. Hacking still sounded mysterious to most audiences. And Cold War nuclear anxiety remained extremely real. Then, WarGames arrived and essentially asked, what if a teenager accidentally accessed military systems capable of starting World War III? Which is an unbelievable stressful premise when you say it out loud. The film follows a high school student who thinks he's accessing a computer game company, but instead reaches a military supercomputer designed to simulate nuclear conflict scenarios. And what makes the movie fascinating historically is that it blended several fears together simultaneously. Computers becoming too autonomous, humans misunderstanding technology, and nuclear systems operating too quickly for human judgment. What stood out to me reading about the film's impact is that the government officials reportedly took parts of the premise seriously enough to begin reevaluating cybersecurity vulnerabilities afterward, which means a fictional movie partly influenced real-world military thinking. And honestly, that happens more often than people realize. Stories shape public imagination. Public imagination shapes policy. Policy reshapes reality. Also, there's something wonderfully 1980s about the idea that global catastrophe might begin because a teenager was bored and curious, which, to be fair, still describes a surprising amount of internet history. And after spending today's episode around governments, collapsing systems, and computers calculating possible apocalypse scenarios, it feels fitting to end with someone whose work quietly held emotional structure together from the background. Because music often does that. People notice it clearly once it disappears. Born on June 2nd, 1944 in New York City, Marvin Hamlisch became one of those rare musicians whose work spread across so many forms of entertainment that people often recognize the music before recognizing the name. Film scores, Broadway, television, orchestral conducting. Hamlisch somehow moved comfortably between worlds that many artists treat separately. And one thing I kept noticing while reading about his career was how emotionally accessible his compositions felt. Some composers create distance, complexity, abstraction. Hamlisch often created emotional immediacy instead. Music people could remember, hum, attach memories to, which honestly is harder than sounding technically impressive. He also became one of the very few people to win an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and a Tony. And while awards alone don't necessarily define artistic value, that range does say something about adaptability and understanding how different audiences emotionally process stories. And maybe that fits surprisingly well beside today's episode too, because every story today involves systems humans built to organize uncertainty. Governments, empires, technology, and music does something similar emotionally. It helps organize feeling. Something I kept circling back to while working through June 2nd was how much human civilization depends on invisible agreements. Agreements that empires matter, that citizenship matters, that computers should help us instead of destroy us. And most of the time, those systems function because enough people continue believing in them together. That's the strange thing about civilization. It often looks solid from the outside, while quietly depending on millions of emotional assumptions underneath. Anyway, that's where June 2nd eventually led me. And before I disappear for the day, here's a quote that felt strangely connected to all of it. Civilization is a progress from an indefinite, incoherent homogeneity toward a definite, coherent heterogeneity. Herbert Spencer. If you'd like to hear more of my narration work, podcasts, or other projects, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for taking a weird little walk through history with me. I'll see you tomorrow.